Hello, grace and peace to you, sisters and brothers in Christ. This is John Reidy once again, sharing with you excerpts from the letter to the Philippians from the New Testament. We're going to do chapter 1, verses 12 through 25 in this next series. This is video part 1. The Zondervan Study Bible titles this section of Scripture, Paul's Chains Advance the Gospel. And if you remember, from our introduction yesterday, that was one of the main points that I wanted you to see, that even though Paul was in chains, even though he was imprisoned, the gospel was advancing. Well, how did that happen? Well, that's what we're going to read about in this first section. Think about what we're going through now. Can this pandemic that we're involved with advance the gospel? Well, sure could. I think that's absolutely possible. Can the crisis that our world is in turn hearts towards God? Well, it can. I mean, time's going to tell whether that happens or not, but history absolutely shows that tragedy, even epidemics of the past, have advanced the gospel. So it'll be interesting to see what God can do with this. So I want you to learn from what was happening in the case of the Philippians, right? There was a situation going on. Paul, the one who was called to minister to the Gentiles, is now imprisoned. And people thought that was going to stop him from doing what he did, that Christ wouldn't be preached in the same manner. Well, they were wrong. God did amazing things, and that's what we're going to talk about here in our study. So we're going to start with verse 12, but before I get there, I want to say a few words about the preceding verses. Paul uses in verses 1 through 11 a customary introduction to a letter, with one exception. He mentions Timothy. And most of the letters that Paul wrote to the churches, he mentions other people throughout it, but he doesn't mention them in verse 1. He doesn't mention them in the beginning. Here he mentions Timothy. Now, all of the resources that I've been looking at pretty much agree that what was going on there is that Paul wasn't necessarily saying that Timothy helped him write this particular letter. He was in the content of the letter. The Philippians knew him. So as I teach from Philippians, I'm going to focus on Paul, obviously. And I wanted to make sure that you understood that. The purpose of the letter that you see in verses 1 through 11 is that Paul is writing to thank the Philippians for their gift. They were very, very generous church. They were good missionaries. They shared with others. They made sure that even the church at Jerusalem, for example, who was going through some financial struggles, had what they needed. Paul asked them to do some things sometimes. They were very willing to do it. This was a very, very generous church. And so part of the letter that we're skipping here is a thank you to the church. He also prayed for them, and not just praying for them in words in the letter, but he continuously prayed for this church. And that's Paul talks about how we need to continually pray, but he lived out what he said. This is actually the first time in the video I've ever had to do this. I got to go get the Bible. So what I'm going to be reading from here is verses 12 through 14. Verses 12 through 14 of Philippians is what I am going to be reading for you. So hear the words of Paul that he wrote for the Philippian church. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. So some amazing things were happening because Paul was in chains. So that's going to be our next focus. Paul wanted the Philippians to understand what he was going through. It was important that he do that. Barnes makes some interesting points as to why he did that. First of all, he clearly cared about them, and they very much cared about him. So a lot of what they were doing was because of Paul, the person who founded their church, helped found the church at Philippi. Did that during his second missionary journey. The second reason, Barnes says, is because they probably were hearing some unfounded rumors about him that he wanted to clear up. Now, unfortunately, those things still happen in our times, and some things haven't changed in the world. As much as the world has changed, there are people who spread rumors. And Paul was more than likely in this letter taking care of some of those rumors, telling them what was really happening. Verse 3, or the third part Barnes points out, is he wanted them to know about what was going on and rejoice over the advancement of the gospel. He was giving them good news. So this first part of the letter really is a report of good news. More and more people were learning about Jesus because of Paul's chains. Now, you'll notice that he's not saying he's in prison. Most likely, most scholars don't think he actually was, the way we'd picture a prison. He probably wasn't behind bars. He probably wasn't confined to a building with other prisoners. More than likely, he was in a house that he probably rented, but he was chained to guards. It's important to understand that, to understand what's happening here in Philippians 1. John MacArthur says the best translation for verse 12 is, for the progress. The advancement of the gospel was a progression. Things moved faster. The gospel was spreading quicker because of what was happening, because Paul was in chains. The Greek term often referred to advancements on a battlefield, so I think the NIV translation is good. What I want you to understand, the gospel message was moving forward in spite of the chains. It was becoming clear to many, many people why Paul was in prison, and there probably was some confusion about that. He was there because he was preaching about the gospel. He was in chains for Christ. That's what Paul particularly says. But the focus on verse 13 is on the whole palace guard. Now, the Zondervan Study Bible describes them as a contingent of soldiers, probably numbering several thousand, many of whom who would have either direct or indirect contact with Paul. Now think about this. He was reaching a lot of people in the palace guard. Some of them were chained to him, but they were spreading the good news among the other guards. And so at high levels of the Roman government, the gospel was being made known because Paul got to witness to the guards. Now, how would that work? Well, he was literally chained to them, and he didn't talk about the weather. Well, he might have talked about the weather. Right now, it's very nice out. He may have talked about sports and the things that were going on. He may have asked them about their families. But the fact of the matter is, while he was chained to them, he was preaching Christ. And they were sharing what they heard with others. In spite of everything that was happening, the gospel was being preached more effectively than it had been before. And that's what Paul wants to make sure that the Philippians are understanding. Isn't this amazing? The result. MacArthur believed that Paul's example was a powerful witness to the gospel, demonstrated God's faithfulness to his persecuted children. This encouraged others to be bold and not fear imprisonment. So because the gospel was advancing in spite chains, people weren't afraid. And because they weren't afraid, many more people were preaching the gospel. So you're starting to get a hope and understanding of how what was happening to Paul, as difficult as it was really helping advance the word about Jesus being Lord and Jesus being Savior. Now, Barnes focused more on Paul's innocence. He focused more about that when he writes about it. The cause of his imprisonment was becoming understood, and it resulted not only in a strong current of favor towards Paul, it was resulting in a strong current of favor toward Christianity, about believing in Jesus. So stimulated by Paul's suffering and his patience through that suffering, others were starting to proclaim the good news of Jesus. Now, there are some today who are blaming God for this mess that we are in. I also want to point out, by the way, since writing the part that I just wrote or read, there is also people within the government who are saying that God is not causing the advancement. They are. The governor of New York actually stated that. But the fact of the matter is that God is at work. And to what extent God is at work depends on who you talk to, I guess who you're listening to. In my opinion, God is doing some things that we'll never realize. But the fact of the matter is we have to trust that God in Paul's situation was doing amazing things through his chains. I think God can do amazing things through the difficult circumstances that you and I are in right now. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share this word from Philippians, because I think it's really going to help us to understand that God advances the gospel in ways that we can't even imagine. So now let's go on to verses 15 through 18 in chapter 1. And we're going to finish with verse 18 today, it looks like. So verse 15 now through, and I'm going to read through to 18. The latter, let me go back a little bit. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, or envy and strife, some Bibles say, but others out of goodwill. Now the latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up some trouble for me while I am in these chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether for false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. He says it twice. So there's a big emphasis there we'll talk about. Now, it's important that you understand Paul is not talking about those who are preaching a gospel different than him. That often happens in the letters. That's not what he's speaking of here. Here, Paul was pointing out that the motivation or the attitudes of those sharing their faith in Jesus, that was what he's focusing on here. Some were doing so out of envy and strife. They were stirring up the pot. They were making trouble. Some were jealous of his apostolic power and authority. I'm sure, according to MacArthur, they were stirring up conflict and rivalry. Barnes points out that Paul's imprisonment was a good opportunity for some to diminish his influence and strengthen their own. For example, right now there are those who are taking advantage of our situation and they're trying to profit from it or advance from it. Now, many things have changed since Paul's times. That's another thing that has not, unfortunately, changed. There are people who are trying to take advantage of this pandemic. Now, there were also those at the time who were preaching Jesus from goodwill, and that Paul focused on them too. They were satisfied, they were content, they supported Paul in his ministry, they loved him, they had confidence in his virtue, despite of Paul's chains. They helped him further the gospel. Now, Paul believes he was appointed, and I want you to understand what that means. Not only was he appointed as an apologist for the advance of the gospel, which is what Barnes focuses on in his writings, but he was appointed to his chains. That's something that MacArthur wanted to emphasize. God put Paul in a strategic position, according to John MacArthur. He believed that he was destined to be there, destined to be in chains by God's will. I think God's aware of everything we're going through right now. What strategic position are you in because of everything that's happening? How can you help further the gospel? Who are you helping? How can you help others in this time? God can make incredible things out of the most difficult times. And that's what was happening here. So here was the way Paul summed it up. Whether the motives of those who shared Christ were false or true, Paul rejoiced that Christ was preached. And for emphasis, he used the word twice. Paul often repeated himself, so do I, but he did it for emphasis. There was a purpose to his repeating himself. He didn't write like we do, in this day and age. He didn't type into a computer, obviously. He dictated his message while others wrote the words down. So if you ever read letters like Philippians and it sounds to you as if Paul was preaching or teaching, he was. He was preaching, he was teaching, and they were writing down the letter to, in this case, the church at Philippi. The fact of the matter is, for Paul, he was rejoicing because Christ was preached. Take time, in spite of everything that's happening, to rejoice. As we'll learn later in this letter, rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. God bless you. Part 2, next time, we're going to pick up a little bit back in 18 and then go right into verse 19. So read 19 through 25. You'll be all set for part 2. God bless you. Take care.